is Attorney Haji, and welcome to my channel, Foreign Tips, the Law and the Markets. Our topic for today's discussion will be obligations and contracts, specifically under the different types of obligations. Okay, so let's start. Now, on our first topic will be the pure and conditional obligations. Okay. Now, what is a pure obligation? A pure obligation is one which is not subject to any condition and no specific date is mentioned for its fulfillment and is therefore immediately demandable. I will give you a simple example. D obliges to pay C 10,000 pesos. In this case, the obligation is immediately demandable if there is no condition and no date is mentioned for its fulfillment. Okay? That is a pure obligation. Number two example is D promises to pay 26,000 pesos upon receipt by D of his share from the estate of X, may mana, or upon demand of C. The obligation of D in this case is immediately demandable because there is no condition prohibiting it. So that is a pure obligation. Now, what is a conditional obligation? A conditional obligation is one whose consequences are subject in one way or another to the fulfillment of a condition. A simple meaning of a condition will give us an understanding what is a condition. A condition is a future and uncertain event upon the happening of which the effectivity or extinguishment of an obligation or right subject to it depends. So there are characteristics of a condition which makes it a future and uncertain event. Okay? First characteristic, it must be future and uncertain. Alangan naman na alam mo na ang mangyayari. Okay? So, in a condition, it must be future and uncertain. In order to constitute an event a condition, it is not enough that it be future. It must also be uncertain. Okay? Number two, it must be past but unknown. A condition may refer to a past event unknown to the parties. If it refers to a future event, both its very occurrence and the time of such occurrence must be uncertain. Otherwise, it is not a condition. Okay? So that is a simple meaning of the pure and conditional obligation subject to a condition. Now, we go now to two principles of condition. Class, take note of these two principal kinds of condition. First is a suspensive condition. A condition precedent or condition antecedent. A suspensive condition is one whose the fulfillment of which will give rise to an obligation or right. In other words, the demandability of the obligation is suspended until the happening of a future and uncertain event, which constitutes the condition. Okay? Now, I will give you an example of this. Si Samson, the owner of a vessel, let's say a bus, and Berto, the purchaser, the buyer, agreed upon the sale of a bus, let's say Ceres, one Ceres bus, provided that the title papers to the same were in proper form. The title was in the name of another, and Samson promised to perfect his title to the vessel. Before compliance by Samson with the condition exacted by Berto, and while the vessel was still in Samson's possession, it happened, an accident happened. Issue: is Berto under obligation to pay the price of the vessel? The answer: no, because the sale of the vessel has not yet been perfected. Because the non-compliance by Samson of the condition precedent to its perfection, which is the production of the papers, proper papers, showing that he was in fact the owner of the vessel in question. Okay, so that is an example of a suspensive condition. Now we go now to a resolutory condition. Okay. So sa resolutory condition, ano to guys? In a resolutory condition, a condition subsequent is one which the fulfillment of which will extinguish an obligation or right already existing. Okay? Here is an example. Samson sold to Berto a parcel of land in consideration of the obligation assumed by Berto to pay what Samson owed to several parties mentioned in the deed. If Samson paid his debts, the sale shall become inoperative. Okay? So dito, inoperative and void. But if Berto paid the same debts by reason of Samson's failure to do so, the sale made shall become absolute and irrevocably and automatically without the need of any execution or any other deed of conveyance. B, in this case, Berto paid the debt of Samson. Here is another example of a resolutory condition. A seller, the vendor, seeks rescission of sale for violation by vending of a restriction. The facts: a contract of sale of 3 lots between Samson and Berto provided that only construction exclusively for residential purposes shall be built on the property. Okay? Only for residential purposes. Subsequently, Berto sold 2 lots to Meralco, which established a substation within the property. Because of the severe noise from the substation, Berto filed a complaint for the rescission of sale. Tanong: can Berto rescind the sale of the 2 parcels of land to Meralco? The answer: no. It is Samson which has the right of action against Berto. And Samson cannot rescind the contract between Berto and Meralco because it was not a party to it. Okay. An example of a resolutory condition is simple. Okay? I will give you 10,000 pesos every month until you graduate. The 10,000 pesos per month allowance is immediately demandable. However, upon graduation, that 10,000 monthly allowance shall be extinguished. That is a resolutory condition. Okay, before we forget, this distinction between suspensive and resolutory conditions. Class, you need to memorize this. Number one, if the suspensive condition is fulfilled, the obligation arises. While if it is a resolutory condition that is fulfilled, the obligation is extinguished. Number two, if the first does not take place, the tie of law or the juridical or legal tie does not appear. While in the other, in the resolutory condition, the tie of law is consolidated. Number three, until the first takes place or until the suspensive condition takes place, the existence of the obligation is a mere hope. While in the second, the resolutory condition, its effects flow, but over it hovers the possibility of termination. That is according to Manresa. So don't forget this distinction because we might not know, this might come in the final exam. Okay, we proceed. Okay, continue our obligations with a period. Now, as we all know, so you've read in the books, an obligation with a period is one whose demandability or extinguishment is subject to the expiration of the term, which must necessarily come. In other words, there is a day certain when the obligation will arise or cease. Okay? Here's an example. D is obliged to give his car to C on May 1, 2016. And, wait, May 1, 2016. Okay? Now, on May 1, 2016, the obligation becomes demandable by reason of the expiration of term or period. The period here is one with a suspensive effect, meaning the happening of which will give rise to the obligation. Number 2 example. On January 1, 2016, D allowed C to use his car only until May 1, 2016. The obligation is demandable from January 1, 2016, but on May 1, this 2016, this obligation to let C use his car is extinguished by reason of the expiration of the term. The period here is one with a resolutory effect, the happening of which extinguishes an obligation. Here, C must therefore return the car. Okay? Now, the concept of a period and day certain. A period is a space of time which determines the effectivity or extinguishment of an obligation. Thus, the space between January 1, 2015 until January 1, 2016 is a period, the lapse of which will cause an obligation to arise or cease. Okay? There are only two kinds of period. The first is this is a period with a suspensive effect. Here, the obligation becomes demandable upon the lapse of the period. That's X day. While in a period in DM, this is a period with a resolutory effect. The obligation is demandable at once, but obligation is extinguished upon the lapse of the period. Okay? Take note of these two kinds of period. There. We go now to alternative obligations and facultative obligations. The kinds of obligations according to the number of prestations. Okay. Simple, one, where there is only one prestation. While compound, one where there is several prestation. Okay? The concept of an alternative obligation is simple. An alternative obligation is one where several prestations are due, but the complete performance of one of them is sufficient to extinguish the obligation. I will give you an example. An example, a very simple example of this is D is obliged to give a specific ring, a specific watch, or a specific bracelet to C. The delivery of any of the three articles will extinguish an obligation. That's a concept of an example. Here, we make it specific. Jojo loans 500,000 pesos to Carla. Okay? Jojo here is the creditor. Now, the contract that Carla entered into with Jojo, after a year, Carla will pay 500,000 pesos plus interest of 10%, meaning 50,000 pesos interest will be due for payment next year. So, yun. Okay? Or, Carla will give Jojo a brand new Vios. Or, Carla will give Jojo a brand new house. Or, Carla will marry him. Get the point? Okay. Now, in these examples, any one of the option of Carla, either to pay the 500,000 pesos with 10% interest, meaning 50,000 pesos, for a total of 550,000 pesos, a Vios car, a brand new house, or marry him, will extinguish the obligation. Clear? Alternative obligation? Okay. Now, the right to choose a prestation belongs to the debtor unless it has expressly given to the creditor. Now, kung hindi nag-uusap si Jojo at si Carla between the following options, Jojo, ano bang pipiliin mo? Papakasalan mo ba si Carla? Kukunin mo yung bahay? Or yung pera na lang? After all, you have the choice in accordance with law. But if it was specifically stated in the contract that Carla has the right to choose, so maghihintay ka. Okay? Clear. A facultative obligation, its concept. An obligation where only one prestation is due, but the debtor may render another in substitution. Okay. Dito, the example in the module that I gave you is D is obliged to give a specific ring to C with the agreement that D may deliver a specific watch as a substitute. In a facultative obligation, only one is due, but the other may be a substitution. Okay. Now, if D, dun sa example natin sa alternative, is ganito. Jojo has loaned 500,000 to Carla with a substitution right now in a facultative obligation. Carla can substitute what? The car, the brand new house, or marrying herself to Jojo. Who has the choice? Here in facultative obligation, if the non-payment of 500,000 pesos is unbearable or is not possible, Jojo may choose or Carla may give something in substitution to his obligation, and when Jojo accepts the substitute obligation, then the obligation is extinguished. Yan ang facultative obligation. Okay? Clear? Now, you must distinguish between the two in order for you to determine with clarity. Pag alternative, any prestation is in alternative, several prestations are due, and the fulfillment of one of them is sufficient to extinguish the obligation. While in facultative, only one prestation is due. And in our example, it is only the payment of 500,000 pesos. But the principal, the debtor, can substitute something to comply with the obligation. Okay? So you memorize this, and I hope that you get it this time. Okay? Joint and solidary obligation. Guys, madali lang to na joint and solidary obligation. In a joint obligation, in a joint and or solidary obligation, there is a concurrence of two or more debtors and or two or more creditors in one obligation. Okay? So here in a joint obligation, each debtor is liable only for a proportionate part of the debt, and each creditor is entitled only to a proportionate part of the credit. Okay? Example, A and B is indebted to X for 10,000 pesos. In a joint obligation, A is only liable to 5,000 pesos while B is only liable for 5,000 pesos. That makes 10,000 pesos. Okay? Their obligation is equal. Now, however, in a solidary obligation, each debtor is liable for the whole obligation, and each creditor is entitled to demand payment of the whole obligation. Now, in the previous example, A and B are indebted to X for 10,000 pesos. Now, whoever between A and B is liable for 10,000 pesos. And X can demand from any one of them the payment of 10,000 pesos. Okay? So, that's clear. That's very easy. Now, kinds of obligation. Dali lang to. Kinds of solidary obligation. Simple lang naman to, guys. Ito yung passive, active, passive solidarity, and active solidarity. and a mix of both. Example. So, sa passive solidarity, there is solidarity on the part of the creditors. While in active solidarity, no, in passive solidarity, there is solidarity on the part of the debtors. Ibig sabihin, I will give you an example para maliwanagan kayo. A and B solidary debtors are indebted to X for 10,000 pesos. Previous example. Now, X can demand payment of 10,000 from either B or A. If A pays X 10,000 pesos, the obligation is extinguished. A can demand then reimbursement of 5,000 pesos from B, representing the latter share of the debt. That's passive solidarity on the part of the debtors. Now, in active solidarity, this is solidarity on the part of the creditors. Okay? Now, for example, A owes X and Y solidary creditors of an amount of 10,000, or here in our example, it's 8,000 pesos. Now, either Y or X may demand payment of 8,000 pesos from A, and the obligation extinguished if A pays it. Now, whoever receives the amount of 8,000 pesos must give 4,000 pesos to the other, representing the latter share in the credit. Okay? That is the only thing that you should understand. Okay? Clear? Okay. Now, there are also other terms for solidarity obligation, meaning jointly and severally, individually and collectively, in solidum, mancomunata solidaria, or juntos separadamente. Pag sinabi naman ng joint obligation, proportionately, pro rata, mancomunada, and mancomunada simple. Okay? So, it's clear. Joint and solidary obligation. So, this is the part na kailangan nyong. So, once again, this is your professor, Attorney Haji, and watch out for our next topic. Thank you and good night.